In this episode, we talk about the reasons behind Cyclone Fengal causing such massive destruction. We also talk about a portion of an almost 180-year-old mosque being demolished in Uttar Pradesh. But first, we talk about the unrest in Syria. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. After 13 years of civil war, the final push to overthrow Syria's president Bashar al-Assad took less than 15 days. On 8th December, rebel forces overran the capital of Damascus, while Assad seems to have fled to Russia. The Syrian conflict had been frozen for the past few years, and Assad's regime had managed to stave off any possible insurrection in the last 13 years. But that changed last week when the rebels moved against the Syrian regime's army. To learn about the conflict in Syria, how it escalated, and what led to the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime, we have the Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor Shubhajit Roy joining us. Shubhajit, can you tell us what is happening in Syria and why is it in a state of unrest?
As you know, Niharika, in the last about a week, 10 days or so, the rebels in Syria, which is like there are the Islamist rebel groups and there are these groups which were anti, Bashar al-Assad regime, which have been fighting against the Bashar al-Assad's regime's troops, essentially the Sri Lanka and the Syrian army. They managed to advance pretty quickly in a sort of a lightning offensive, almost took everyone by surprise, and managed to slowly capture the Syrian capital, Damascus. And what happened then was, as their advance was sort of imminent, the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad, he left the country for Russia along with his family. And so Syria has now been sort of plunged into a situation where these new groups or these rebels are now have taken control of the state television, apparatus. And now they have said that there's a new interim leader who's taking charge of the country as caretaker prime minister, with obviously the backing of these rebels who managed to topple President Bashar al-Assad this week.
And Shubhajit, for our listeners, can you trace this conflict back to when it started?
Syria, the conflict started in 2011, when the Arab Spring started first in Tunisia, then Egypt and Libya. So in March 2011, people, some Syrians, some groups also started protests against Bashar al-Assad, who was the Syrian president. But their protests were met with brute force by the regime, who did a sort of a very violent crackdown and put down these protests and sort of jailed many of them. So the fighting went on, but in the last, say, 5-6 years, it was a frozen conflict. So there was sort of a stalemate situation where the Syrian rebels were managing a part of northwest Syria, which is Idlib. But the rest of the country more or less was under control of the Bashar al-Assad regime. There were some parts also they were where ISIS, Islamic State, had also able to manage control. And as you know, since 2014, there was ISIS territory on which there were sort of the US and the Western forces conducted airstrikes and sort of tried to, diminish them. So now the situation is that in Syria, as we are seeing the reports that, after almost 50 years of rule by the Assad family, Bashar al-Assad, so his rule came to an end this week, and with that, his family's rule came to an end this week as the rebels have now captured power.
Tell us about Bashar al-Assad and what led to a sense of discontent amongst Syrians as far as he was concerned.
Hafez al-Assad, who was the father of President Bashar al-Assad, he actually came to power in 1971 until he died in 2000. And then Bashar al-Assad became the president of Syria at the age of 34, 35. In 2000, he was a trained ophthalmologist, but then he sort of took charge of the presidency. He was actually not interested in politics at all. I remember meeting him in 2008 when he visited India, and he came across as a very modern and secular leader at that point of time, protecting the minorities. He, in fact, Syria was a Sunni majority country, but he himself belonged to this sort of minority community called the Alawites, a sect. He said that he protected the minorities, and even in Syria, he was, seen as someone who was very modern and secular. In fact, back in December 2009, I remember CNN called him the most popular leader in the Arab world, with about 68% Arabs voting for him. His style was very informal, would interact with people in restaurants and public places. When they again went to Syria in 2011, the protests had started against him. And while this veneer and facade of a very calm and composed liberal leader was there, but he also was very iron-fisted in how he ruled the country. So there was an authoritarian style of functioning there, where he controlled all levers of the power with the Sunni elite, which is the business elite, and the army there. This was also completely under his control. So there was no real democracy there. So he sort of put down anyone who was in his opposition with sort of brute force. So that was Bashar al-Assad.
And Shubhajit, these rebels that you are talking about, can you tell us about these groups and why they have been rebelling against the regime?
This rebel group, which is now was responsible for advancing and then capturing the Syrian capital Damascus as they marched into the capital, is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It's the acronym as HTS. That's it, how it is being referred to. It is essentially a group of liberation, that is what of Levant or of Syria. That's how it means. It is led by a guy called Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, also spelled as al-Jalani, and that group sort of defeated Assad's forces. In fact, in April this year, Jalani, he told his sort of commanders that, God willing, we will celebrate Eid al-Fitr in Aleppo and Damascus soon, and Eid is still 4 months away. We saw, but over the last 6 months, main allies, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, have been either distracted or weakened or diminished, and that gave an opening to the rebels. So Assad's army was actually on its own, and it was unable to defend some of the key cities against the rebel groups. In fact, HTS owes its links to Al-Qaeda, and and also sort of there are reports that Turkey too is believed to have supported some of these rebel groups.
And Shubhajit, now from here, how do we see things moving forward as far as the situation in Syria is concerned?
Well, so there is sort of obviously jubilation and joy in the streets of Syria, where we see pictures of people celebrating, and there are also statues of Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad also being brought down. So far, the HTS and the rebels have told the Syrian army and the current establishment that they will not harm them if they flip sides, and they want peace, and they have also assured of protection to the minorities, which has been a concern for many, that whether they would harm the minorities or not. But we also have to look at history about how the Arab Spring experiment in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi quickly unraveled into chaos, and how in Egypt the Muslim Brotherhood took control after Hosni Mubarak was brought down. So there is a sense of caution in the Indian establishment here, how it will play out in Syria post-Assad, so that is one big concern Although HTS's chief Al-Jalani has so far tried to assuage the fears of the minorities. In fact, after taking over of Aleppo, one of the cities, on 29th of November, he said that the first priority is to protect the property and lives of civilians and to establish security and calm the fears of people from all sects. And he said, don't judge by words, but by action in an interview to CNN last week. Obviously, people here are also across the world. They are watching the actions and are hoping that they don't turn out to be like Taliban in Afghanistan or Islamic State in Syria some years ago. So there is a sense of caution, and the jury is still out about how things will play out.
And Shubhajit, if we talk about India, what kind of a stance has India taken as far as everything that's been happening in Syria is concerned?
India obviously has sort of issued a statement saying that it advocates, peaceful and inclusive Syrian-led political process, which respects the interests and aspirations of all sections of the Syrian society. So this inclusive Syrian-led political process has been India's catchphrase or term even during the civil war after 2011. And so this is in sync with that approach that India had adopted at that point of time. And India has said that, MEA in his statement said that we are monitoring the situation in Syria in the light of the ongoing development. We underline the need for all parties to work towards preserving the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Syria. And we advocate a peaceful and inclusive Syrian-led political process, respecting the interests and aspirations of all sections of Syrian society. The Indian embassy in Damascus is is open and is in contact with the Indian community. There are some, I think, 90 Indian nationals in Syria. So the number is really small, including some 14 of them who are working with various UN organizations. And the Indian embassy has been in close touch with them for their safety and security.
And Shubhajit, how do we see the situation in Syria impacting geopolitics as a whole?
That's a great question, Niharika. As we see right now, so Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, these were the primary backers of Bashar al-Assad. So they seem to have got a body blow after this fall of Assad's regime. Iran similarly was also seen as strategizing and helping Assad throughout the Syrian conflict. And it not only helped it with the military tactic and strategy on how to handle the situation when the opposition groups took to arms it also sent in the Hezbollah fighters, very trained, very battle-trained fighters, accomplished Hezbollah fighters were sent for the West, especially the US. They have been celebrating because they have been against the Bashar al-Assad regime and had been supporting the rebels in the initial years, but they quickly pivoted toward targeting the Islamic State, which was also in the region, making its role a bit complicated. But it seems like they have won this round. And the other big beneficiary is Turkey. Turkey had supported this Syrian opposition-led army. And in the recent weeks, it is now believed that Turkey also had a role in the mobilization of the HTS and the Syrian opposition army. We'll have to see how this plays out in the coming weeks and days, how these rebels and opposition groups which have past ties with Al-Qaeda and, they behave, and whether they carry out revenge or whether they are able to stick to their word about protecting the minorities, and whether Syria, from being a secular and modern society, it spirals into a much more conservative society. So all these issues, we'll have to see how it plays out in the next few weeks and months.
Next, we talk about Cyclone Fengal. Cyclone Fengal, which made its landfall near Puducherry on 30th November, was a low-intensity storm as it maintained the wind speed of about 75 to 95 km per hour. However, the cyclone left a trail of destruction in its wake. Residential colonies saw water entering homes, leaving vehicles partially submerged. Trees were uprooted, power lines snapped, and major roads rendered impassable. Relief centers were set up with voluntary organizations stepping in to supply food to affected residents. To learn how a low-intensity storm could cause such massive destruction, we have the Indian Express's Anjali Marar joining us. Anjali, what kind of weather changes did Tamil Nadu and Puducherry experience when the cyclone made its landfall?
So, as the cyclone was inching closer to the eastern coast, the rainfall had already started and the weather had become stormy, and extreme weather were being reported from parts of North Tamil Nadu and Puducherry. In fact, even neighboring areas like Kerala or South Interior Karnataka were experiencing cloudy weather and rainfall. So, in that sense, Cyclone Fengal was able to affect a larger geographical area, though it was a cyclone category storm. And in terms of rainfall, these are record rainfalls for Puducherry or Viluppuram in the northern Tamil Nadu. At least in the last 30 years, these regions have not received such massive rainfall in a day, that too in November. Though Tamil Nadu, Puducherry do receive rainfall during the winter season, they receive rainfall during the northeast monsoon, but this was a very typical scenario. The rainfall was triggered by the cyclone, and 50 centimeter or 49 centimeter rainfall is unprecedented for a place like that. And overall, the northeast monsoon since the mid of October, when it made its onset, the rainfall has been good over the southeastern coast, that is Tamil Nadu, Puducherry. So there's already a lot of humidity, a lot of water percolation happened that in the soil. So with such massive amounts of rainfall again occurring within few hours overnight between the intervening night of 30th November and December 1st, the water holding capacity naturally will be limited. So the impact is multifold. The water will just not be able to hold on, and it just led to flooding and overflowing of low-lying areas and landslide events.
Right. And how huge would you say Cyclone Fengal was in comparison to the previous cyclones that have hit the Indian coastline?
Cyclone Fengal was a cyclone category, or one of the lowest among the cyclone categories which has affected the Indian coast. India has experienced far more intense storms, for some of them being Cyclone Amphan or Phylane or Fani in the recent past. Whereas in that comparison, Cyclone Fengal was just a cyclone category. By that, I mean where the wind speed was about 75 to 95 km per hour. So in terms of intensity, it was not a massive storm to affect the Indian coast. We've had even intense stronger before.
And Anjali, what kind of an impact did it have? Can you tell us about the destruction that the cyclone caused?
So despite being a comparatively low-intensity cyclone, Fengal was able to wreak havoc, or its intensity and its aftermath was massive. It caused multi-hazardous destruction, mostly around northern Tamil Nadu and Puducherry. The associated rainfall was one of the main reasons which led to massive flooding and inundation, displacing people from their homes, crippling the transport, be it air, road or rail. So in comparison to what the intensity was and what it could potentially cause destruction, it was way higher than what a normal cyclone would have caused. This even included human casualties. India has advanced cyclone prediction and cyclone warning centers. Then there is a very well-placed mechanism where people are rescued and all precautions are taken. Even in this case, that was a scenario. But despite that, the casualties rose to 12, and even some unverified reports, or there are reports also mentioning that the casualty has risen to even 20. So in comparison to the intensity, the amount of property destruction and loss of human life is much higher.
And why would you say that was? Why was Fengal so destructive despite being a low-intensity cyclone?
Cyclone Fengal, according to the India Meteorological Department, was a cyclone category, that is at the time of landfall, that is when it was moving on towards the land from ocean. It had a wind speed of about 75 to 95 km per hour. Since its origin in the Bay of Bengal, Cyclone Fengal has been showing a tendency of extremely slow movement. And this made it very difficult and challenging for the Met agency to even predict its track well in advance. Just before the landfall, during the late night of November 30th, and post its landfall, Fengal was practically remaining stationary over close to Puducherry. So I would just want the listeners to imagine having a tap sitting on your head constantly and there's water coming out of it. So it was pouring, it was intensive rain over a localized area just because the storm wasn't moving. And because it lasted for about 12 hours, the rainfall it resulted in on the December 1st was massive. So to give you some figures, Puducherry recorded nearly 470 millimeter. Then Villupuram, the place in northern Tamil Nadu, received 510 millimeters in 24 hours. So just to give you a perspective, these rainfall figures, 400 and something or 510 millimeters, there are places in India, say for example in Rajasthan or in Maharashtra, this much amount of rainfall is an annual rainfall in those places. So imagine receiving 50 centimeter rainfall in less than 24 hours. So it has to be, devastating in that case. So mainly the slow movement of Fengal is being attributed as one of the main reasons why, despite its lesser intensity, it caused massive destruction and devastation.
Right. And Anjali, can you tell us about the rescue operations that took place in Puducherry and Tamil Nadu in order to improve the situation?
So soon after the Met Department was more sure about the landfall, which was predicted to be close to Puducherry, both Puducherry and Tamil Nadu governments did follow the standard operating procedure to rescue the people from the coastal areas and take them to shelter homes. But because the landfall was also during the late evening and throughout the night, as I was mentioning, the rainfall continued as the system had not moved. What it caused is a lot of inundation to people's homes and they had to be rescued. So the army and the NDRF were called in. And there is a place called Tiruvannamalai. It's a district, again, close to coastal district. There were reports of landslides in that area following the massive rainfall. So the rains had already started even before the cyclone had hit. So 2 successive days of rainfall had led to incidents like landslide incidents. Then there were cases of electrocution and deaths because of that. So these are the multi-hazards which caused, and both Army and NDRF were involved in the rescue operations.
And in the end, we talk about a demolished section of a mosque in UP. A portion of an around 180-year-old mosque in Uttar Pradesh's Fatehpur was demolished yesterday as it was allegedly encroaching upon the Banda Fatehpur road in the city. While the district administration said that a notice had been served to the Noori Jama Masjid to remove the encroachment structure, the development came at a time when the mosque committee had approached the Allahabad High Court seeking relief. Avinash Tripathi, Additional District Magistrate, ADM, Finance and Revenue, Fatehpur, told the Indian Express, quote, "The committee had filed some petition in High Court, but it is yet to be listed for hearing," unquote. He further added that the structure that was demolished was built in the last 3 years and the main building of the mosque was intact. According to Tripathi, the Public Works Department had issued notices to 139 people, including shopkeepers, house owners and the mosque committee in August to remove the structures built by encroaching upon the road. The PWD sought to remove the encroachment to begin work for strengthening the road and constructing drains. ADM Tripathi further said, quote, "The PWD had marked the encroached sections of all the buildings. Although served notices removed the encroachment in September, the mosque committee also demolished encroached parts of the shops built adjacent to the mosque. The committee had assured to remove the structure which is the part of the mosque, but they did not make it," unquote. The PWD had sought help from the administration to provide security while the alleged encroached structure of the mosque was being demolished. Adequate police force was there to maintain law and order on the spot, and there were no protests while the demolition took place, the party said. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by me, Niharika Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.